So this morning we are on a journey. The reason why we are picking this series to start this year is well, you'll see as we get going, but the fact that we're on a journey as a church this year, and this journey is going to be a journey that isn't really summed up with logos and mission statements and things like that. It's really at the heart of it, it's going to be defined by our church and us as individuals being transformed. And the heart of mission, we believe, is worship. And how we worship and how we move our allegiances to what our heart normally defaults them to be, to worshiping the one true God. And how that then changes our lives as we go. So how we can be about God's will in the world together. And here's the reality: the world is changing, and it's changing rapidly. And part of the emphasis of this series is how do we live? How do we be followers of Jesus in a world that doesn't seem like home? And as our world changes, how do we discern really kind of what it means to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did in these times, in the times we find ourselves? And so the heartbeat of the book of Daniel is the account of a young man who, a very young man actually, when he's taken into exile, we believe he's between the ages of 12 and 15, a young man who finds himself in a world that is dramatically different than the world he was born into. And he's sent into exile, and no longer is Yahweh worshiped in this land. No longer do they have the temple. No longer do the people of Israel have the view of the world that God is supreme and Yahweh is in control. Babylon is completely different. And through the life of Daniel, we're actually going to get pockets of wisdom and discernment and faithfulness that gives insight into how you and I can live right now. You with me? And so let me start in Daniel chapter 1, and then I'll give you a little focus on where we're headed. It says this: in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put it in the treasure house of his God. Now, stop right there. Typically in ancient Near East culture, when one group of people did war against another group of people, it wasn't just the people fighting against each other in their view. It was their gods fighting against the other gods. And so when you lost a battle in the ancient Near East, your God lost. And your God lost, and when your God lost, the articles from that worship were subsumed into the worship, the temple of the God that took over. That's a big, you got to understand some of these things. I mean, that is an earth-shattering thing if you lost a battle. Okay, then it says this: then the king ordered Ashpenaz, king of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect. That used to be my life verse. You know, when you would never mind. Handsome, showing aptitude, you get it, right? For every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. So all you single ladies, this is it right here. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So much happening here. We're not going to get all into it this week because there's so much more background to do, but needless to say, Daniel and his 3 friends are going through a total Babylonian immersion program. Their minds were about to be changed. At least that was the point. They were to become full-on Babylonians. Now, here's the thing. Today, what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to go talk about what led up to this really briefly. And how did Daniel get here? How did the people of God get here? Because one of the most prolific themes in the scriptures, cover to cover, is the theme of exile. Exile is from the beginning to the end. And it's something that us in our culture, we don't really get. We don't understand exile. It seems uncomfortable. And what I think is really important for us to understand as we head into the series is we're going to talk about exile today. Next week, we're going to be talking about what it looks like to be a creative minority, which if I can't explain it, but you have to come next week. It's really important. Then we really, really get into the book of Daniel. But this background is really important because otherwise you're just going to read the book of Daniel from just your own Western American perspective, okay? And so here's a brief history of exile. And if you're new to the scriptures, this is going to cover a few things. But it all starts in the garden. The first exile is Adam and Eve, right? What happens when Adam and Eve sin? Audience participation. They get kicked out, right? They get kicked out. Listen to this. Genesis 3:23 through 24. It says, so the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden. He's talking about Adam, to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way of the tree of life. So Adam and Eve in their failings, right? In their failings, they're kind of an archetype for humanity. They're kind of a picture of what it looks like to be human. Their sin led them to being cast out of their home and to live in a place that was foreign to them. This was the first exile. Then there's a pattern in Israel that we'll see as we get further and further. But then we have Abram. The story of Abram, we read this, listen to this, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, it says this, the Lord had said to Abram, okay, go from your country, your people, your father's household to the land I will show you. And then he goes on to give him some promises. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And then it says this in verse 4, so Abram went. And the Lord, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. What did he have to say goodbye to? His land, his country, his people, and his family. 75 years old. You'd think you'd get pretty acquainted with your land, your country, your people, and your family. And God told him to go. And he said goodbye to all of that. Then we get the story of Joseph. Joseph's brothers, a little bit further on in Genesis, Joseph's brothers kind of get mad because he's like this special kid, whatever. They throw him in the pit. They pretend like he's dead. They sell him to gypsies. We always threatened our kids with that if they acted up. Long story, it's pretty funny, but I'm not getting into it. Anyhow, so Joseph gets sold to these gypsies who ends up in Egypt, away from his family, away from his land, away from all of that. He's in exile, right? Then we've got Moses and the people of Israel. We got them in Egypt, captive in Egypt for 400 years. The people of Israel are captive. That's longer than our country has been in existence. They're captive in Egypt. What started out as a huge blessing, being fed during a famine in Egypt because of Joseph, turned into captivity and slavery. Moses comes along, leads the people out of Egypt. Okay? They have this chance to go into the promised land. They screw that all up. They don't believe, they don't trust God, and then they are in exile in the desert for 40 years. The theme of exile just keeps coming. It just keeps coming over and over again. Then we have the Babylonian exile. This is the one with Daniel. Okay? This is for like nearly 1,000 years, the people of Israel are actually had it pretty good. I mean, they started off with, they started to get into the dynasty with David and all that kind of stuff. And up until the birth of Jesus, there was about 1,000-year stretch there. God's people, for a while there, had things pretty good. They were worshiping God for a little while. They were doing everything they were supposed to do. But over time, the people forgot. Over time, the people forgot that God had blessed them so abundantly. I was meeting with Dan this week, and we were talking about this theme of exile. And the idea in the book of Deuteronomy, and actually in a lot of other places in the Old Testament, there's a constant theme of remember. That God is always telling the people, remember, I'm the one that blessed you. I'm the one that took you out of Egypt. I'm the one that did all these things. Remember, remember, remember. They had feasts and festivals and ways that they would worship throughout the year in the calendar to remember and remember and remember. And yet they forgot that it was God that was one who blessed them so abundantly, and the results were catastrophic. One wicked king. Okay, when we get into Immerse, anybody started reading yet? Okay, there is, okay, the first part is exciting because it's an enormous genealogy, okay? But I want to encourage you, don't skip that part. There are actual real good nuggets in there, right, Dan? You're just lying to me, right? No, there are. There's really good stuff in there. But it gets to this point in Chronicles where it talks about one wicked king after another, and the people were worshiping foreign gods for blessing and protection. And they traded the one true God, the worship of the one true God, for empty promises and walked away from blessing and protection of Yahweh. And so it says this in 2 Chronicles 36, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord of the temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the king of Persia came to power. Exile. Life-changing. Earth-shattering change. The book of Lamentations talks about exile. Verse 1, chapter 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That's out of Lamentations, It says, after affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. A few verses later, in verse 11, it says this, all her people groan as they search for bread. They barter their treasures for food to keep themselves alive. Look, Lord, and consider, for I am despised. So they come out of exile at some point later. Some of the prophets, we'll be talking about this, some of the prophets try to tell the people it's only going to last a couple of years. Don't worry. Like, don't even unpack. And Jeremiah says, they're lying to you. This is going to last a long time. You better settle down. And even when they get back out of exile, things aren't the same. I mean, they go from the Babylonians to the Persians, then they're on their own, then there's so many warring factions around them that want a piece of them, then there's the Greeks and the Romans, and there's so much happening in the history of the people of Israel. And it continues into the New Testament. You think, oh, Jesus is here, no more exile. 1 Peter 1:1. Peter uses Old Testament language to describe what it looks like to be the people of God. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, exiles, scattered throughout the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. A little later, he says this, since you call on a Father who judges each person's work impartially, live out your time as foreigners here in reverent fear. The idea for the New Testament church was that they were not of this place, that they were not Romans, they were not citizens of this world, they were actually citizens of heaven, and they were in a sense foreigners and sojourners and strangers in the land. They didn't fit. It didn't feel like home, right? And then we actually get a picture of who Jesus is in the New Testament. Philippians chapter 2 tells us about who Jesus was, that he did not consider his place with God something to hold on to, but made himself nothing, right? Made himself a servant, made himself an exile in human form, an exile in our humanity, rejected and despised, kind of an alien to this place. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward as well. So the conclusion, where I'm going with this, is back to Daniel. Here, Daniel and his friends are in a place that is now under a different king. A king who worships a different god, the god Marduk. Sounds like a comic book character, I know. And I think when we think of Babylon, what we think of is a stereotyped place of like pure evil, like everything, there's just violent and bloody and depraved and all this stuff. But really that wasn't the case. Yes, there was violence. They were the world's biggest superpower. Huge military. They had the city of Babylon, it had 2 walls around it, not one, 2, 20 foot thick, 20 foot high. You went through the first one, you had to get through the second one. Super safe and secure, technologically unsurpassed by any other group of people in the world. They had the best weapons, the best technology, the best minds. The beauty and the wealth of Babylon was unsurpassed. Have you heard of the Hanging Gardens? I mean, they still have they're still digging this place. They're just like, they're blown away. Archaeologists are like, this is unbelievable. Secure, comfortable. And yet the authority and the ethics and the values of the place were all different. I'm going to make the case to you. Well, I'll wait a second. In the book of Daniel, we see that God is at work. At the first part of Daniel, we see the fact that God actually sent his people into exile, that it was actually God's doing, that he allowed the king Nebuchadnezzar to come and take them away. That God was actually in control of that, that's tough to wrestle with, right? I'm going to be honest with you. That's a tough one. We'll get into that a bit too. That God gave his people over. But then, Daniel and his friends, God gave them favor. We'll see that at the end of chapter 1, that God gives them favor, that God gives them wisdom, that God actually sustains Daniel and his friends in exile. And in addition to that, we know that God ends up sustaining the people of Israel, the remnant in exile, and he fulfills his mission through his people, which is really, really cool. So they understand that heaven is not their home, but he ends up using this place of exile for them to learn what it looks like creatively to worship God faithfully in exile. And so what this is going to do for us is a few things. It's going to help us as followers of Jesus to ask questions like, what does it look like to be faithful to God now? What does it look like to be faithful to God now? What does it look like to live courageously here, right now? And all the issues of faithfulness and mission that we talk about, it's all about worship. It's all about allegiance. It's all about who we worship and why we worship. And part of that realizing that we're going to have to go through is that our cultural moment has changed. If you've been following Jesus for a long time, if you're of the older generation, my generation and older, the things that we're going to talk about in this series are actually going to be really hard. I'm going to be honest with you. They're going to be really hard because it's not everything we've experienced in our growing up. Maybe you found the Lord 20, 30, 40 years ago. Things have really changed. Some of you, and this is what I love about our church, we are a multi-generational church. Some of you who are more of the millennial crowd, I'm not about to make fun of you, but you experience the world differently. You are asking different questions about Scripture and about faith and what it looks like to be living out your faith following Jesus here and now. But we're going to talk about history. We're going to talk about history of Christianity in America. We're going to talk about all those things in the next couple of weeks because God uses exile in the life of Israel to remove from them the things that they trusted in. Okay? They no longer had a nation with a king. They no longer had a temple. And those things just reinforced and validated some things in their life. So they're stripped of all their cultural institutions. They have no king, no temple. But God reminded them that he was still sovereign and still with them in captivity. And he was refining their faith. Take a look at this quote from a guy named Rick McKinley. He's actually a pastor of a church in Portland. Tremendous guy, great author. He wrote this: exile was a period when the promises of the past and the shape of the future had to be evaluated in terms of a new experience without the traditional self-validating structures such as the monarchy, the land, and the temple. Meaning, they lost their land, they lost their king, they lost their temple, and yet, for every other group of people that would lose those things, the worship of their God, their king, and their land, they were done. But as we'll see in the pages of Daniel, God is very active and moving to the point where Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, actually acknowledges that the God of Daniel is the true God. That is unheard of in the ancient Near East. And so, for the exiles stripped the people of Israel of all these foundational things. And the prophets spoke words of assurance. Despite all the things they're experiencing, God had not abandoned his people. He was still with them in their exile. So next week, we're going to talk about our present moment, because if you haven't noticed, our present moment has changed. And if you just want to know, here's a little quick example to how that works. I have a friend of mine, his name is Monty Newton. He used to be a pastor of a local church over here, and he retired. But in his last year of retirement, I would try to spend as much time with him as I could, right? I just get advice, how do I do this for a long time? And because it's hard. And he's like, listen, he's like, you young guys have it so bad. I'm like, what are you saying? He's like, no, listen. He's like, when I was a pastor in Kansas, at I guess a big town in Kansas. I don't know if those exist, but like, he had a pastor discount card. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, I was issued from the actual like Chamber of Commerce. He was issued this laminated pastor discount card. And he'd go out to breakfast and flash that thing, and they're like, oh, pastor, 15% off, you know? I'm like, you can't do that now. People ask me all the time, so what do you do for a living? And I'm like, I'm in nonprofit work, you know, because it's people, like the conversation shuts down. So things have totally changed. And so what I'm arguing today is something that's going to be hard for us to wrestle with. And we're going to argue it for a couple of weeks. So maybe not. What I'm arguing is that to follow Jesus is to experience exile. That part of what it means to follow Jesus means you're a foreigner, you're a stranger, you're not of this world any longer. You are a citizen of heaven, and you are an exile here. Jesus even said this in John 17. If you read his prayer for the people who would come to know him, you are in this world, but not of this world. Exile is the place where we live out our faith in Jesus. Exile is the place where our allegiance to Jesus is practiced and lived out. And what do you do when the institutional structures that supported your faith are gone or slowly crumbling away? You can do one of three things. First one is you can just assimilate into culture. So when you get pushed into exile, but that was the goal of exile. Nebuchadnezzar was smart. He split people up all throughout the empire and just mixed them in with his own people. So that after 5, 10, 20 years, what? You're one of them. You're one of us now. You're not going to band together. He didn't put them all in their own city so that they could like form a plan, you know, and figure out how to overthrow King Nebs. No, they didn't do that. He split them all up all throughout the empire so they would slowly change, right? Assimilating into culture, adopting their view of life, adopting their sexual norms, adopting their gods, changing what satisfies their heart into what satisfies the heart of the people around them. Conforming. That's one way you could do it. The next way you could do it would be you could like fight back. You could fight the power, right? You could take back, we got to take back the country. You hear that all the time in political ads, right? Fear and all this apocalyptic language, and you can categorize people as they're in or they're out or whatever. Here's the thing. All the book, Daniel, there's a bunch of apocalyptic language towards the end of it, and none of it is based on fear. None of it. And there's a third way. And the third way is this: to worship faithfully, to contribute to the good, and to resist idols at all cost. To worship faithfully, to contribute to the good, and resist idols at all costs. And the question is, we got to ask ourselves, did Daniel assimilate? Did Daniel fight back? What did Daniel do? What did Daniel and his friends do? Listen to the instructions that Daniel was given from the prophet Jeremiah as we close. Jeremiah says this: "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all of those carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." He got a letter to them. "Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city for which I have carried you off to in exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. And then Jeremiah jumps into, you're going to be there for a while. And he gets into a little bit more of some of the instructions. So here's what we will see in the book of Daniel. Daniel and his friends serve the king, Nebuchadnezzar, faithfully. They serve him faithfully. We will see that they are a great asset to the king. They do not retreat or disengage. They participate in the shaping of Babylon. And at the same time, they refuse to bow down to the cultural idols of Babylon. They walk this really intense, tight line. Faithful to their God, Yahweh. Blessing the king and the people of Babylon. And they draw the line in weird spots. Here's what we're going to see. This is so amazing. In the first chapter, the second part of the first, we're going to talk about this in a couple of weeks. Daniel, they're given food from the king's table, which had to be rad food. I'm just thinking it's probably awesome. But it didn't fit with their worship of Yahweh, right? And they're given new names. What's interesting is they're given these names that actually mean things about the gods that are worshiped. Daniel's given the name Belteshazzar, which is one of the gods of Babylon. And he's like, that's cool. Call me whatever you want. But I ain't eating that. Right? I'm like, dude, Daniel, have a steak. Have a nice Cabernet. But don't let him change your name, right? He's like, no, I see it differently, Ryan. I see it totally differently. I don't care what they call me. I don't care about my name, but I care about my God's name. And so they walk this line, and they're more interested in protecting God's name, not there. And we're always trying to argue that followers of Jesus, it's more than just praying a prayer to follow Jesus. And it may begin there, but following Jesus requires us to live a life of actual faithfulness now. And repentance isn't just like, oh, I screwed up here and I made this sin and all that, whatever. Repentance is about changing your mind and your outlook on your life, that there's a new king and that requires a complete change in my allegiance. That's what repentance is. Listen to this quote. I got two quotes to finish today. There's a guy named Lee Beach, and this is a great book if you want to read it. It's called The Church in Exile. And this is kind of a taste of where we're going. Exile implies more than simple geographical location. It can be a cultural and spiritual condition as well. It is the experience of knowing that one is an alien and perhaps in a hostile environment where the dominant values run counter to one's own. So it's this idea of like, hey, this is a different place. I need to wrap my mind around the fact that I'm not from here, that I don't belong here, right? And restoration, I'm not going to lie, this series could be pretty jarring to us. Could be pretty jarring to you in the sense that, well, if I'll be honest, I'm trying to convert you. And I'm trying to convert you to a different way of seeing your allegiance to Jesus as you live in Marilonia. Because this is a superpower that is very wealthy, and there's a lot of beauty, and it's safe and secure, and yet there's a subtle inertia, right, that pulls us into a different way of thinking. And I'm not trying to be anti-America. I'm just saying this is an empire. We live in the strongest world power in the history of humanity. And we're called to follow Jesus in it. We're not called to be it. We're called to be citizens of heaven and foreigners here. That's not anti-American. That's allegiance to Jesus. And so the reason why I say that is the theme we've been talking about for years around here is that we're people of the future and that our future shapes our present, right? So one last quote, and we'll wrap this up. This is Lee Beach again. He says, exile is, in its very essence, is living away from home. This is the heart of the Christian faith. As we live away from our ultimate eschatological, that means future kind of idea, community. Furthermore, exile is a result of understanding ourselves as a distinct people. We are strangers in the world. This distinction is defined by our relationship with the supreme God and is rooted in God's call for us to live our lives in accord with this relationship, often in ways that will come in contact with the dominant culture. Meaning, there's going to be some things that we don't participate in because we're followers of Jesus. There's going to be things that we participate in because we influence because we're followers of Jesus. There's going to be things that we push into a culture that they don't have. And there's going to be things that we actually need to stand up against. And we're going to see all of that in the book of Daniel.